Thank you. I'll call this meeting to order. Developing meaningful relationships with our Indigenous neighbors is a priority of the Northern Rockies Region Municipality. As such, we are collaborating with First Nations, governments, and Indigenous organizations to develop a respectful and meaningful territorial acknowledgement. This work also presents an opportunity to learn more about the culture and history of the Indigenous peoples of our region. Please be advised that tonight's meeting is available for the public to attend virtually. It's being streamed and recorded. Can I get a motion, please, to adopt the agenda? Moved by Councillor Andrews. Seconded by Councillor Gerwing. All those in favor? Carried. Admin report number 27. Fort Nelson Community Forest for information. Ms. Thompson.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Before you, I have a report regarding the Fort Nelson Community Forest Agreement. Recently, the Fort Nelson Community Forest just began harvest operations, which is an exciting activity for our community. We're finally seeing harvesting after several years of not seeing it. And obviously, this has generated some conversation within the community. So administration felt it would be prudent just to provide council with a bit of an update as far as revisiting kind of the relationship between the community forest and ourselves, as well as revisit some of those management objectives that are the foundation for the community forest. So as I mentioned, I've got a report in front of you. I understand for the benefit of the public, I'll go through this in a fair amount of detail, but I do assume that the council and mayor are familiar with CFA and some of the information that I will be providing. So since as early as 2010, the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality had envisioned developing a community forest in Fort Nelson. Work on the community forest intensified between 2017 and 2020, and shortly after, a partnership was formed between Fort Nelson First Nation and Northern Rockies Regional Municipality. Jointly, the partnership submitted an application to the Ministry of Forests in 2019 for a community forest in Fort Nelson, which was approved and became effective April 1st, 2020. The community forest tenure is a 25-year area-based tenure, and it covers just under 198,000 hectares within the Fort Nelson timber supply area. So the administrative structure of the community forest is a limited partnership agreement, and there's three parties that are included in that limited partnership agreement. And that is the Fort Nelson First Nation Forestry Limited Partnership, the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality, and the Fort Nelson First Nation Northern Rockies Regional Municipality Community Forest General Partner Corporation. So in accordance with the Partnership Act, the CF Corp acts as the general partner, whereas Fort Nelson First Nation and Northern Rockies act as limited partners. There's a diagram in attachment number 2 that explains or provides a visual concept of that relationship. So through the associated agreements and various legislation, the general partner, so the CF Corp, assumes liability for the business of the partnership. Fort Nelson First Nation and Northern Rockies liability is limited to their investment, and they are considered shareholders in that agreement. So accordingly, in accordance with legislation, the CF Corp, as the general partner, is responsible for the business of the CF, whereas Northern Rockies and Fort Nelson First Nation as limited partners are just responsible essentially for appointing directors to the CF Corp. To the board, sorry. Ultimately, though, the business is the responsibility of the CF Corp. And in bold, I've noted, as the general partner liable for the business of the partnership, the CF Corp must make all decisions related to the business of the Fort Nelson Community Forest Agreement and not the shareholders. So at this time, I'd just like to note that in speaking with the Community Forest Board, an update to Mayor and Council is anticipated in mid-April. Just have not confirmed whether that's going to be an in-person update or if it's going to be a written summary. But either way, we'll ensure that Mayor and Council are provided with that update. So moving ahead to talk about some of the objectives of the community forest. So the Fort Nelson Community Forest Agreement was approved based on the management plan and the business plan that supported the application that was provided to the province in 2019. The general management goals of the Fort Nelson Community Forest include safety and sustainability versus profitability. So making sure that local employment, economic development opportunities are available, and providing a revenue source for startup, as well as managing a diversified timber resource. There are other objectives and goals of the Fort Nelson Community Forest, which is the incorporation of traditional knowledge, wildfire prevention, and ensuring that forest policy is adhered to and incorporated in their activities. There's two underlying economic objectives that were identified in the business plan associated with the Fort Nelson Community Forest, which was rebuilding the local forest industry, associated jobs and spin-off revenue, and also generating revenue from log sales that will be reinvested back into the partner communities. The business plan, which also formed part of the application to the Ministry of Forests and Lands, included it included verbiage around where products would be produced and sold. So essentially, conifer sawlogs were intended to be sold locally and outside the Fort Nelson area, whereas deciduous logs could be sold locally, and to a lesser extent at the time, it was envisioned they could also be sold to the oil and gas industry. But I do need to note that the business plan further identified that there was uncertainty as far as where those markets existed, just based on some of the variables that the local economy was experiencing at the time and still continues to experience. The business objectives identified in the business plan include short-term, which are 1 to 5 year, mid-term, 5 to 20 year, and long-term 20 to 100 year business objectives. So currently in their first year of startup, they're in their short-term business planning cycle, which is that 1 to 5 year period. And the objectives for business generally focus on the management of the license, development of operational capacity, generation of startup revenue, the establishment of one more local producer, and the exploration of alternate markets for non-timber resources. The report also speaks to mid to long-term business objectives, which basically focus on reinvesting profits back into the communities and the establishment of long-term employment opportunities for local residents and the provision of funding towards a large-scale capital project. So with that, I will finish up there, and if council has any questions or would like to discuss further.
Does anybody have any questions for Ms. Thompson as to Northern Rockies Region Municipality's relationship with the community forest? Councilor Penny.
Great report. Thank you very much. I don't really have any questions. Actually, I just wanted to speak to council about this a little bit more on this. I notice it kind of bounces back and forth here about what the community forest is designed to do. It says that it's there to provide local manufacturing and build jobs here. That was my thought right from the beginning when I heard of a community forest even being formed. I thought it was so we could actually take control of our fiber in our area to make sure that we don't end up like we did in 2008 and shut down. And what we see right now, I know there's a lot of concern. I'm willing to bet that all of us sitting at the table are hearing about these logs headed down the highway. And I think there's some misinformation out there on exactly who is taking these logs and where they're coming from and whatever. But I understand that putting some money in the coffers of the Community Forest Board is going to be helpful going forward, just so they can actually hire some people to actually run it for them, so we don't have to have an outside source and that sort of thing. I just wanted to make it clear my stance on it, that going forward, I would like to see the community forest take every possible action to ensure that as much, if not all, of the fiber included in community forest stays here, whatever that takes. So that's all.
Thank you, Councillor Penny. I note in the community goals, it does talk about creation of local employment and economic development opportunities for our region, and provide a revenue source for the supporting partners communities. So that would be Fort Nelson First Nations and us. So, you know, I believe, as you do, that the community forest is there to serve our communities, either by supplying revenue or by supplying employment to our community. Ms. Thompson, did you want to speak to this more?
I will add that I have had conversations with the chair of the CF board, and they're quite, you know, passionate about making sure that, you know, the fiber stays local as much as possible and providing those opportunities to local where possible. They have entered into one agreement with a local producer and working on a second, but quite adamant that, you know, that's their vision as well, is to keep as much local while still trying to ensure that they do have that money and revenue for startup and making sure that the CF is successful in the future. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Any other questions for Ms. Thompson? Councillor Gerwin.
Yeah, I don't have a question, more of a comment. I remember when the whole thing started and we went line by line with staff and legal. I don't have the agreement before me, but 2 points that I wanted just to highlight is that although the CF Corp is at arm's reach of Fort Nelson First Nations and of the NRM, they still have to adhere to the values that have been identified. And so that led me to think about what dispute resolution process, if any, because I think we have one in place if the board doesn't agree, but I don't know that there is a dispute resolution mechanism put in place for if the NRM or FNFN or the community at large feels that the CF Corp is not holding true to the values of the agreement. Council can't get involved with the CF Corp directly, either could FNFN. So what dispute resolution mechanism is available if the community feels like the values are not being upheld?
I would defer to Mr. Berry, but I would think that one of the options for the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality would be to replace the directors. That would be a...
Well, they have terms, so you can't just...
No, but not immediately.
I don't have all the answers specific to that. We can check into it, but you know, council does reserve the right to remove directors and bring directors in if you feel that the directors aren't representing the needs. But I understand what your question is more around the bigger picture from the community or the partners, I mean, I'll call it the shareholders per se, FNFN side and the NRM side, if they're not meeting, what options are there to I guess navigate or to adjust course, I guess I think is what you're suggesting, Councillor.
Yeah, and even if like maybe we just missed it when we did all of this, but like mayor and council isn't even allowed to talk to the CF board. So if we're hearing that there is an issue, where do we go with that? Because we can't talk to the board.
So it's not that you can't talk to the board, you can influence the board. You can't be influenced them in terms of interfering with their operations per se, right? So it's the day-to-day operations. The board still essentially reports back to the shareholder, reports back and provides updates to the shareholder. You're the shareholder. What you don't have the ability to do as a shareholder is to deal or make day-to-day decisions or interfere, for lack of better words, with day-to-day decisions and be part of that because it's a business being run that way. If the direction of the corporation wasn't going the direction that regional council thought or thought there was some issues, you're within your right as a shareholder to communicate those concerns. It's just you can't, you know, it's drawing that line, ensuring that you're not interfering with day-to-day decisions of the board, right? But as you'd said, there was a vision or a mandate that was provided by council at the very beginning in terms of what the intent is. That's where these statements came from. If they're not being met, then the shareholders have a right to say, we don't think that you're operating to meet these visions, right? This is where when a presentation, when the board presents to council as a shareholder, that's the time to provide that feedback or ask certain questions. It's just ensuring that you're not providing direction in terms of how the organization is run. Right?
Okay, so if I may. So if there was a case in point, somebody or a business in the community that felt that they had been wronged or their proposal was not accepted and sufficient reasons weren't given, what is the resolution mechanism? They go to the CF court, they're not happy without that outcome, they go to individual counselors, mayor, like, and then let's just say that happens, and let's just say somebody comes to me with this issue, where do I go?
Well, first you'd have to confirm that if there was an issue or concern, to confirm that the issue or concern was, I guess, you have to validate, I guess, that concern.
But
one way
who's
or
we?
another.
Like,
Well, as a counselor, you know, someone has an issue, they can bring something forward to you. I guess it depends on the situation.
Right.
But
because I
again,
couldn't go directly to the CF board to say, did this really happen?
not necessarily. However, if there's a concern that's brought forward, nothing's stopping you, and that an update occurs to say these are some concerns that have been brought forward. And again, it depends on the situation, right? It really depends on, you know, if we talk a hypothetical situation, we'd almost have to play it out from beginning to end to determine what steps to take. Because if someone is, like I said, to validate that, if someone says they don't agree with X, well, if it's just black and white, or for instance, you say, yeah, I can see this is happening, I don't agree with log movement. You know, well, you'd have a statement or response to that. But if to your question or example, if someone came forward and said, I have an issue because I brought this forward and it wasn't received the way I thought it would be received by the board. Yeah. Again, it would be for them to outline and say, well, this is the situation. Because as an individual, or if it's a business owner or whatnot, they can tell you what you want, right? But that would determine what the next step would be with what you could or couldn't do, and we provide or help guidance or even get advice in terms of how to deal with it, right? But the challenge is could be that, you know, someone may have a concern, but they don't necessarily bring forward what the specifics were to say for you to validate if that concern is a concern based on council's statements and vision for the CFA. It's similar to Councillor Penny's statement around, you know, to what level do you draw the line for the CFA in terms of what it does for the community, right? Like at some point, you know, everything in your power is one thing versus what would be reasonable, right? And what are examples of that? So it's hard to answer the question without having the specifics, right?
Okay, so if I may, so somebody in the community comes to me with a concern, I can go to the chair of the CF board to say, this is a concern. I'm not influencing, I'm needing more information. What I'm hearing you say is I can do that.
I would.
Or if I can't, Mr. Berry, could we set some sort of a resolution mechanism, put that in place so that the community members and or council knows the route? Because now it's wonderful that activity is happening. I would suggest that there's going to be a few issues along the way, and maybe we should put something in place to address them.
Yeah, and we can for sure. And I think those are discussions that, again, there's certain things we have to understand the situation. I wouldn't suggest that every time someone brings an issue forward, that you pick up the phone and call the chair or because that would be, you know, I would say crossing and overstepping the boundary potentially. That said, the shareholders act as a whole. And if someone had an issue, if you brought an issue forward, for example, it would be wise to probably bring that issue forward to council to discuss with council, the shareholder, right? But I think it's probably something that we would want to investigate to provide some detail in terms of how we would handle that appropriately. So council has some, and staff for that matter, ensure where the boundaries are, right? So I mean, this is, you know, I mean, obviously we've never had a community forest. It's the first time we've seen harvesting. The agreement was in place and went through the previous council, and this is why we're kind of doing this. I'll call it CFA 101, in terms of understanding some history and why. But sometimes we need to reach out and just ask a question, how do we deal with this, or what are some examples of what's the best approach? And if there is a specific issue that way, in terms of that, it would be something to bring forward to council, and staff can help get some information in terms of how to deal with it. Sometimes they're dealt with would be dealt with on a case by case basis, depending on what the situation is. And honestly, without having any detail or understanding what that concern is, it's difficult to provide guidance or feedback specific to what you're looking for, except I understand your bigger question in terms of you want that kind of rule book or roadmap and how to deal with it.
Councillor Penny.
I totally understand where you're coming from there, Scott. I mean, it is difficult to understand we'd have to get a grasp on what the actual problem is, but also from Councillor Gerwing, I think we definitely need to set a process in place, irregardless of what the issue is, because let's just say that the resident or the business doesn't have a connection to either one of us, doesn't feel comfortable coming directly to one of us. They've already dealt with the CF Corp, so that's where their problem arose. You know, they may not have a personal relationship with anybody in this building to know how to get through. So we'd need to lay some groundwork there to their first place that they would send in their grievance as such. And I mean, there's lots of community forests in the province, so I'm willing to bet we're not the first one that may run into an issue, right? So maybe we can investigate that and see if other community forests have had grievances or issues or something, and how they dealt with it instead of us having to reinvent the wheel.
We'll definitely reach out for sure and see what's out there. I mean, at the end of the day, the community forest, the director, it's a legal entity, right? So some people, and the link to this is that the shareholder, regional council, partner is the First Nations, but sometimes businesses don't provide the answer that maybe an individual or a group or company might want and don't like it. And I understand the issue. So we'll for sure look at, see what those options are and provide some feedback at the council. I don't know if Lisa, if you got anything else that you might want to add or.
No, we can certainly look into that. I think one of the important things to remember is that the partnership was set up the way it was for certain reasons. So there's two limited partners, which are Fort Nelson First Nation and Northern Rockies, and the CF Corp is it is a business, and they are responsible for the business. The limited partners were set up separate from the general partner to limit liability, essentially. So when you start crossing lines between business and shareholder, then those lines get blurred. So it's important to kind of remember, you know, whatever questions you're being asked of the public, is this a business question? Then it should go to the CF Corp. But if it is a fundamental question around the objectives of the CFA, the values of the CFA, the vision of the CFA, that's something more that we would deal with as a shareholder. So it's just, you know, to keep that in perspective as well.
So look, go ahead,
Sorry.
Councillor Penny.
I did have a rebuttal or not a response here. I totally understand how this is a business, it's an entity, and I mean, but at the same time, right in its name, it's community forest. So we all, you know, everybody in this community has a vested interest in it. So it's a little bit different than just some corporation sitting in downtown whereverville, right? So having some avenue for people to reach out if they do have some sort of issue, and at the same time, like you said, you don't want to have to deal with every little petty little thing if somebody's not happy. When it comes to building our community back up, I think it would be great for us to lay some groundwork, some matrix in place for it.
So I'm supportive of coming up with a process, but I guess one of the things I would say is that each of us as councillors are not shareholders. It is the group, the Northern Rockies, that is the shareholder, and not even just the council, but the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality. So I would think that if as a councillor you have an issue, the proper thing to do would be bring it up with the council and have a discussion. And then the council, using the resources of our staff as a shareholder, would go to the CF Corp and voice those concerns. And then we would have the benefit of having staff's input, and we would have the benefit of having the councillors' input, rather than having each individual councillor go to the CF Corp. Seems to me a little bit, I don't know if you'd use the word inconvenient or inappropriate, or not exactly how this should operate if the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality is the shareholder. Councillor Gerwin.
So I agree. That's why I think that we really need a dispute resolution process so that this council, the next council, and the next council are all operating from the same understanding. And then my second point is, as a shareholder, being the NRM as a shareholder, can we request that the CF Corp develops their own dispute resolution process and that it is well advertised throughout the community, all communities, so that our community members will know that they don't have to come if they don't want to come to council, or that there is a process if they're not happy, and then what happens. I think we're just missing that piece.
I guess the other piece that would go along with that, Councillor Gerwin, is the fact that we are the 50% shareholder, and we would have to, if we were going to give direction to the directors of the corp, we would have to do that in conjunction with our partners, FNFN. So I imagine a conversation would have to happen there first before the shareholders went to the directors and gave them specific direction to do something like that. Councillor Penny.
He's brought up a really good point. Shareholders and getting together. I wonder, prior to the pandemic breaking out, we were well on our way to developing a more face-to-face relationship with FNFN, and especially when it comes to our partnership in this, I feel it's very important that we meet on a regular basis. So I just want to get that back out there, that we should, now that we can meet in person again, I'd like to get that back up and going, and very specific to even to speak about our partnership in this CFA right now. Now that it's finally up and going. I mean, we spoke about it before, other councils have spoken about it, but now we're actually seeing logs all out. It's probably time that we sit down and see how each partner feels about how the operation is going.
Mm-hmm. And I think when we instruct the directors of the corporation, we have to do it together, as not just together as the NRM, but together as the NRM and Fort Nelson First Nations, because we can't have two shareholders giving directors two different directions. So anyway, is there any more conversation about this? Very well, we'll move on. Administration report number 28, land acknowledgement. Ms. Shepherd. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. So Gabby and I have prepared this report tonight together. We'll just bounce back and forth. So as Council's aware, following engagement with First Nations communities and Indigenous stakeholders, we are tonight presenting you with a draft land acknowledgement framework. We're recommending that First Nations governments and Indigenous organizations have an opportunity to provide comments on the draft framework. And then we'd like to bring it back to Council for an opportunity to review the framework with the inclusion of our engagement partners' perspectives before Council has final review and adoption. I'll pass it to Gabby.
So before you is the draft land acknowledgement framework, and we've included just a few slides just to facilitate conversation throughout our presentation. So within the draft framework, we've incorporated a number of sections. To begin with, it provides an overview of the framework itself provides an overview of the intention of developing a land acknowledgement and furthering the work that Hillary and I have been doing the last few months. So you'll notice in the draft framework, we do provide just a preliminary overview of the Indigenous communities within our region. And we felt that this was an important step, important information to include in the framework, as it would further the reader's spatial awareness and just further people's understanding of which Indigenous peoples, which Indigenous communities are located on the land base, or perhaps rather have a long-standing connection to the land base. And following that overview in the framework, we've incorporated some language on page 2, just to provide further guidance on when it might be appropriate to incorporate a land acknowledgement. And further to that, on page 3, we've included a few sample land acknowledgements that we can discuss further in the presentation. And then we've chosen to conclude the framework just providing a broader account of reconciliation efforts being taken across Canada and within British Columbia specifically to further reconciliation. And you'll notice on pages 4 and 5, we have chosen to include some terminology, or rather definitions, to conclude the document. So that being said, we can jump over to the slides here. So maybe we'll just ask just to go back one slide. So Hillary and I, we have prepared just a few slides here again, just to bring attention to where First Nations communities are located or situated within the regional municipality. And again, this speaks to much of the information that is included in the draft framework. So you'll see here just on the first slide, the purpose of including this slide was just to draw Mayor and Council's attention to where Treaty 8 and Treaty 11 are situated. So you'll notice that the two treaties do encompass a large area, encompassing multiple provinces, not only British Columbia. And then I'll pass it over to Hillary just to provide further account of the First Nations communities in our area.
Yes, we can hop to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you. So here we're discussing Akodeniko First Nation. So Akodeniko First Nations traditional territories span the Northwest Territories, Northeast BC, and the southeast portion of the Yukon Territory. The nation's main community resides in Fort Liard, Northwest Territories, and Akodeniko members are part of the Dene Group. The nation is a signatory to Treaty Number 11. And go to the next slide. Deneja First Nation is situated in Northwest Alberta, with traditional territory crossing into Northeast BC. The Deneja people are divided into 3 separate communities located in Northwest Alberta: Bushy River, Meander River, and Chade. The nation is a signatory to Treaty Number 8. Some of you may be familiar with our most close proximity being like the Rainbow Lake area. And then the next slide. And Doig River First Nation peoples, Sache Ne Dene, are descendants of the Deneja people, indigenous to the Upper Peace River region of BC and Alberta. The nation's traditional base extends in all directions from the city of Fort St. John, and Doig River First Nation is a signatory to Treaty Number 8 as well. And we can go to the next slide. And then we've got Fort Nelson First Nation. So Fort Nelson First Nation community is, as we know, located 7 kilometers south of Fort Nelson. The nation's Dene families are related to the Dene of Southern Northwest Territories and Northwest Alberta, and trace their roots to historic villages throughout the territory. The nation's Cree families trace their roots to villages in the Peace and Athabasca River basins, coming to the territory in the 1800s to Old Fort Nelson to trade furs and purchase goods at the Hudson Bay Post on the Fort Nelson River. Fort Nelson First Nation is also signatory to Treaty Number 8.
Thanks for that, Hillary. So we just have a few more First Nations communities to go over, but perhaps I'll just pause here and ask if council has any questions at this time.
Any questions? No? Very well.
Okay, we'll continue. So following that description provided by Hillary, we've also provided a brief account of Kaska Nation. We haven't yet had communication with Kaska Nation. We have had some communication with one representative of the nation, but we would be looking to connect further. So as you've seen here, just on the map on the screen, showing the traditional territory of Kaska Nation. So as you can see, it is a transboundary nation in that its traditional territory spans into British Columbia, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. And the Kaska Nation, it's comprised of 5 Kaska First Nations, 3 in British Columbia, which include the Deludena Council, Dease River First Nation, and Quadacha First Nation, as well as 2 in the Yukon, which include Ross River Dena Council and Liard First Nation. It's noted that the 3 BC First Nations are members of the Kaska Dena Council. And that being said, you'll note that Kaska Nation, it's not a signatory to a treaty, whereas Akodeniko, as Hillary noted, is a signatory to Treaty 11. Dene Daw First Nation, Doig River First Nation, Fort Nelson First Nation, and Prophet River First Nation are signatories to Treaty 8. So that's of note for Kaska Nation specifically. Following that, we have also provided an account of Prophet River First Nation. So Hillary and I had an opportunity to speak with the chief of Prophet River First Nation in October. We were fortunate to visit the community in person. As you're well aware, the nation is located about 100 kilometers south of Fort Nelson. Again, it is a signatory to Treaty Number 8. And Prophet River First Nation, its peoples are indigenous to the boreal forest region of Northeast BC. And then we also have provided a description or an account of the Métis community. You'll note that the sample land acknowledgements included in the draft framework do acknowledge the enduring presence rather of the Métis community in our region. And so Hillary and I have taken the opportunity to learn more about the Métis community, its connection to the region, as well as its connection to Canada broadly. And we were, or rather I'll say, when we met with representatives of the Northern Rockies Aboriginal Women's Society, NORAS, they provided some information to us on the Métis community in our area, both in Fort Nelson and in the region. So that provided broad rationale to incorporate, or rather acknowledge, the Métis community in the sample acknowledgements. So following that, I'll pass it back over to Hillary just to provide maybe a little bit more information on the intent of the framework going forward, as well as next steps.
So as you just seen in the last few slides there, we have developed a fair understanding of the Indigenous communities in our region. So the framework is intended to equip regional council and staff with an understanding of the communities as well, to encourage cultural awareness across the organization, and to support efforts to develop meaningful relations with Indigenous peoples. So in next steps, in the draft land acknowledgement framework, there are some sample land acknowledgements on page 3 that are drafted for council's consideration. And as per the option in the report, we are recommending that we engage with partners to be provided with an opportunity to review the framework and comment, and we'd like to bring those comments back for council to review before final adoption. In the meantime, we are hoping to have continued use of the interim land acknowledgement. Yeah. Does council have any questions or thoughts?
Any questions? Councilor Roper.
No questions, just a comment. I really appreciate the thoroughness of this report. And I know that for myself, just going through it, just even with a cursory glance, I have a better understanding of the cultures in our area. So thank you very much for this very important report.
Job well done. If there's no other comments, then I'm going to ask for a motion on the recommendation of the First Nations, governments, and Indigenous organizations be provided an opportunity to comment on the draft land acknowledgement framework. And that the draft land acknowledgement framework be brought back to regional council with the inclusion of the perspectives of our engagement partners for review and adoption. So moved. Moved by Councillor Penny, seconded by Councillor Roper. All those in favor? Carried.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I get a motion, please, to adjourn the meeting? Moved by Councillor Roper, seconded by Councillor Andrews. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you. And we are adjourned.